Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're still in Filipino American History Month. I'm Dr. Robin Rodriguez, and I want to welcome you all to the first of the three-series webinar, or the three-part webinar series, I guess is the best way to call it, that we're offering as a free preview of the full 6-month Filipino American Experience course that I will be launching in January 2022. We wanted to give folks a chance to check out some of the material that I'll be covering, along with a whole team of experts. And when I say experts, we're talking scholarly experts to community organizers and artists. I'm going to be bringing on a whole array of folks through the 6 months of the course, again, starting in January, along with presenting my own research, my own work. And for today, we're going to be talking about Larry Itliong, talking more broadly about how we actually do the work of remembering our Filipino American collective histories. I just wanted to really make this very casual. In fact, all of the webinars that we will be offering as part of the free preview will be relatively casual. I don't want this to feel like an intimidating college level course. College level courses can be intimidating. This webinar series, as well as the course that we'll be launching in January, is meant to be accessible to as many people as possible, that the material isn't overwhelming and intimidating. Going to be kind of more do this kind of talk story style, giving as much information as possible, but in ways that are, I'm hoping, relatively easy to understand and digestible. So today I wanted to tell a little bit about the background of Larry Itliong, some of the work that I've been doing in building up the Welga Digital Archive, and yeah, just talking story about Filipino American history on this day. Now, yesterday was when we really had hoped to do this. I had this great ambition of actually doing this live in Delano, where our manong Larry Itliong is buried, and which is the site for the Delano grape strike of 1965. We were already in Delano, the Poplar Delano area, this weekend in celebration of the dedication of the Larry Itliong Resource Center in Poplar, California. But I was just exhausted. We had actually, it's been Filipino American History Month is always super, super, super busy for me. I don't know how many events anymore that I've done this month, but it's been a lot. Just last week, what was it? There was the Filipino American History Month event on Friday here in Elk Grove. We're really proud. I live in Elk Grove, California, which is just outside of Sacramento. We were successfully able to get the city and the school board and the county kind of Parks and Rec district to recognize Film History Month. We had a great celebration Friday night. Then next morning, we went on a road trip. We kind of previewed what I hope to offer later as part of the School for Liberating Education. We want to be able to offer a Filipino American road trip class. So if you don't already follow me on Instagram, I'm at Mad Professora. And on Saturday, I had a group of my former and current students come with me on a road trip down to Poplar, California for the dedication of the Larry Itliong Resource Center. We made a couple of stops, including a stop at the Fonz National Museum in Stockton. It was a very, very long drive, a really exciting drive, but very tiring, because in the next day, we kind of had to get up super, super early in support of the all-day event honoring Larry Itliong in Poplar, California, then in Delano. And so I think I was just too physically exhausted after all of that, so needed to take a pause yesterday. And it was just as well, because yesterday, if I had recorded the webinar, then we wouldn't have been able to do some other things, including actually paying homage to Manong Larry by visiting his grave in Delano. So we had a chance to do that yesterday, as well as meet with a current Manong, I guess you could call him, who was who grew up in Delano, California, knew the Manongs who were active in the Delano grape strike, who had who knew Manong Larry, and who has taken it upon himself to continue to ensure that Manong Larry and all of the other Manongs who organized around the grape strike are remembered. So he hosts these local tours in Delano. His name is Roger Gadiano. And for those of you who want to join in our Filipino American road trip in March, we're aiming for mid-March to go, and we'll be taking signups for that. But it was great because by taking pause from this and actually doing it today, we were able to pay respects to Manong Larry, have lunch with Manong Roger, and start to map out our plans for the Filipino American History Road Trip, which I'm really, really excited to be able to offer. And for those of you who are joining for this webinar, as of course, as you know, this is part of the free webinar series, but the course that we're launching, we are inviting folks to invest as they can in registration and paying the registration fees. What I'm trying to do here is to offer Filipinx history, Filipinx courses as broadly as possible through this online platform. But of course, none of this is free. All of it does require labor, for which I'd like to be able to pay. I want to be able to pay our students who work with us, to pay my assistant, and hopefully also generate enough surplus so that we can actually run free programming that we can offer to the broader community through a nonprofit that I'm in the process of establishing in my late son's name. Some of you know that my older son passed away in August 2020, and I really want to be able to continue his legacy as well as a new ancestor by doing programming through a nonprofit in his name. And we're really trying to source funding that's independent from just the foundations that are often so restrictive, and really trying to source resources from our community to build the Amado Kaya nonprofit and just other institutions that we really need in our community. One of the things that I learned from our manongs, it's incredible. Our manongs worked as low-wage farm workers, and they managed to pool their resource together to buy land, to buy buildings, to build and erect buildings. And we had rich cultural institutions and businesses in the early early decades of the 20th century. And this was all built by our community members who, again, didn't have the kind of access in terms to employment and resources the way we do. And yet we are still lacking when it comes to institutions. And I'm hoping that by me establishing the School for Liberating Education, offering these kinds of courses to the community, having folks in the community invest what they can into the school, that will allow us to then redistribute resources in new kinds of ways for the community. So let me just dive in to the presentation for today. So this is a photo of Cesar Chavez, of course, very, very well known to many folks, along with Larry Itliong. And this is just a quote from some of the people that we've been interviewing who are helping us to really reconstruct and understand Larry Itliong as a man, Larry Itliong as a labor organizer, Larry Itliong as a leader for the Filipino American community. Because the truth is that, and you could take pause if you want to just look for yourself, we could take a moment and y'all can go and do a quick search on your favorite internet search engine, or on your phone. And you will find that if you try to locate books about the farm worker movement or Cesar Chavez or Dolores Huerta, another Chicana labor leader, you'll find numerous books written by scholars, written by journalists on Cesar Chavez, on Dolores Huerta, and even on the farm worker movement. But what you'll find, especially if you look at the books that are even about the farm worker movement more broadly, that any discussion about Larry Itliong is often confined to a few pages or maybe even in a footnote. And the truth of the matter is there has not yet been a definitive biography or scholarly treatment or just a deep dive into Larry Itliong's life and his contributions. The only thing that we've really been able to get, thankfully, and it was really such a tragedy for our community when we lost her, but Dr. Don Mabalan, along with Gail Romasanta, were able to collaborate on an illustrated book, A Journey for Justice, that documents Larry Itliong's life and contributions, that was based on the intensive research that Dr. Don Mabalan did before she died, but she was unfortunately taken from us too soon when she passed away in August of 2018. And so the work that she had put in to not only produce the illustrated book, that was only one small portion of her overarching project. She wanted to be able to write a biography of Larry Itliong, a more scholarly and treatment, but we weren't able to get that from her. And so part of what we do, as many of you know, I am the founding director of the Bulosan Center for Filipinic Studies that happens to, at least in the present moment, be based at UC Davis. But one of the things that we were doing, even prior to the Bulosan Center being established, is that we had created the Welga Archive. And part of our intention in creating the Welga Archive was that we knew that when it came to Larry, and not just Larry, but many of the other Filipinos who contributed to the farm labor struggle, we didn't actually have much in terms of primary sources. That is, we didn't have much of the documentation, the photograph, oral histories of people who knew them, or even direct accounts from any of these manongs that we could really draw from in being able to construct a rich biography of Filipinos, of Larry, a rich biography of Larry, but even just a rich account of Filipinos' leadership and contribution to the farm worker movement. So when Don was still alive, we were working together. I was trying to do the work along with our team, our archivist, Jason Sarmiento and Glenn Aquino. We were trying to do what we could to locate as many people as possible who were living at the time of Larry Itliong, who might be able to give us an account of his. Meanwhile, Don was going from archive to archive at different university archives, where some of the records where the records of the United Farm Workers was kept, and other kinds of archival information that might have been preserved. And she was mining all of these archives to try to get what might be out there in terms of documentation, ephemera, photographs, to also construct kind of an understanding, or to really develop an understanding of Larry. And so we're trying to work in partnership and collaboration as much as possible, so we could really try to fill out the historical record. Now, lots of people really agree that it's so imperative that, as it says on this slide, that all children here in the United States, I would say even in the world, know that they have heroes and that they know the history of Larry together with Cesar. What's really important is, at the end of the day, as much as we are very invested in telling the story of Larry Itliong and other Filipino farm worker leaders, this is, at the end of the day, one story, an interconnected story, an interwoven story of Filipino farm workers alongside of Mexican farm workers, and Yemeni farm workers, because it was actually also farm workers from Yemen who were part of the establishment of the United Farm Workers. I'm just going to ask you to mute. I think somebody might have forgotten to mute when they hopped on. So anyways, just taking a quick pause for that. But at any rate, while I'm super invested, and so many other people are invested in really amplifying the Filipino contribution to the farm worker struggle, to really amplifying the role of Larry Itliong in the farm worker struggle. Again, what's so important is that what made Larry distinctive and what made the United Farm Workers really important historically is because it was a coming together across racial lines of Arab, Asian, and Latinx workers. And that it's really one story that we're trying to tell. It's our kind of collective story, our people's story. And so, for me, really not just lifting up Larry, but lifting up the legacy of interracial solidarity that Larry, I think, really represented is why it's so important to do this work. Oh, sorry. So I just really love this quote. So this is a quote from a woman whose father was also a leader in the United Farm Workers. He was Chicano. He passed away, unfortunately, last year. Luckily, Don Mabalan was able to interview Mr. Rojas before he passed. And so we do have an oral history with him. But I really love this quote, and I wanted to share it all with you. We might have all these stories in history, but if we don't know them, how can we become empowered by them? I think that's really an important quote. We need these stories. Not only do we need these stories collected, but we really need these stories. We need to know them and to share them so that we can be empowered by them. I just also wanted to share this quote about from Dr. Don Mabalan. One of the things she said, and this is something that we really take to heart in the work that we've been doing in the Welga Archive, is this. She says, "We have lost much of our community's history because of the assumption that our past is not history, that it is not an American experience worthy of interpretation and analysis." She also says, to some people, newspapers, community programs, photo albums, etc., were only junk, or at best someone else's memories rather than history. And I just, I've always been moved by this quote by Dawn. And this is something that she writes in Little Manila is in the Heart, her book about Stockton. And that is that oftentimes in our own community, we, again, sometimes we may not think of ourselves as part of historical beings, that we are ourselves in the lives that we're living right now, contributing to history. We may often think about our ancestors. We may be thinking about the kinds of responsibilities we may hold as their descendants, but we may not actually think about ourselves as also ancestors to others who will descend from us. And so when that happens, and this is also sometimes part of the process of internal colonization, when we devalue who we are, what we do, this is when our history gets lost because we don't value our own lives, our own contributions, those of our family members, because so much of the way that history is written, right? Or the way that history is taught is often centered on major historical figures. And those historical figures tend to be people who are the presidents, right? Or even major industrialists or capitalists, right? We learn about these kinds of histories of these so-called great men, and so much of how what's valued in terms of the historical record in kind of academic history, or even in the way we're taught in the public school system, right? All of these other figures, they are the people who make history, as if we don't also make history and contribute to history. And so I love Don's quote because it reminds us that we have the responsibility of telling our own stories, and that our stories are valuable, and that we shouldn't devalue all of the things that the lives that we've lived and all of the artifacts of our lives, because all of that contributes to our communities, our people's collective history. And so that's what we've been trying to do in the Welga Archive is, we're asking folks, go under your bed. You have stuff in boxes, take it out. All of that is important for chronicling our collective history as Filipinos in America. Y'all got stuff in storage, take it out. Don't throw it away yet, because a lot of these may be artifacts of our lives that are important to share out to our descendants. If you have stuff in your garage, etc. If you have stories, the story, your own migration story, how you came to come to America, all of the different struggles and triumphs you've had as an individual or in your family, all of that becomes so important to be preserved, to be passed on. And then hopefully there will be the historians who will weave all of those different artifacts and oral histories together to interpret and analyze that for a new generation. So I just wanted to share a little bit from Dr. Dawn Mabal and how much she continues to really inspire my work as a scholar activist, our work in the Welga Archive. This is just a picture of us together. I have such great stories with Dawn. We had gone down to Delano in 2015. I was actually at the time about to pop pregnant with my second son. But, because we know that time is precious, life is precious. So you don't really know when our time, in this form on this earth will come to an end. And I think, for both of us, I don't know, maybe Dawn, if you knew deep down, or I knew that somehow we were just going to have to do it, even if I had a full, pregnant belly, and I knew I was going to be tired from the trip, but Dawn and I would travel together down to Delano. And I just remember a great time where we met with yet another elder. Thankfully, he's still alive, Gil Padilla. He's a Chicano leader of the United Farm Workers, was a leader with the United Farm Workers, knew both Manong Philip Veracruz and Larry Itliong. We spent a whole day together with him, hearing him talk story, looking at his photo albums. And Don and I, we're trying to do what we can again to kind of better understand Larry Itliong with what remains, right? Those who continue, who are still alive, who have the stories in their head that can, we can then, record and save to photographs that people have in their homes. And so we were able to do that together. And there's another time, of course, we were able to go down and spend with Marissa Arroy, who did the wonderful documentary on Larry Itliong and the forgotten Delano Manongs. So again, it takes all of this work to actually celebrate Filipino American History Month, right? If there is none of this kind of work of documentation that we do, locating people to hear their stories, collecting those stories, finding those his photographs, digitizing them, preserving them, all of these, the other kinds of artifacts. If there aren't the people who go out and do the work, we're hard. How do we celebrate Filipino American History Month, right? We need all of the ongoing work of historical research to actually ensure that the stories get told. So let me just actually focus now on Larry's history, or Larry's story, and talk a little bit about Larry's story within the broader context of Filipino migration history. And as you'll see, some of the things that we pull into that I pull into this narration of Larry Itliong's story is stuff that we did, or I did, through the Welga project with our archivist and filmmaker, as well as drawing from Don Mabalon and Gail Roma Santa's work together, and just piecing all together this, weaving together this history of Manong Larry. So of course, Modesto Larry Dulay Itliong, he arrived in the United States. Oops, sorry for that. On April 6, 1921, at 15 years old in Seattle, Washington. And he was joined by tens of thousands of young Filipino men. You know, that you see here, there's a photo just of young Filipino migrants posed on a passenger ship. And this is around the 1930s to 50s, because that was when some of those, the migration of Filipinos was really happening en masse, was it really beginning in the 1910s through the 30s. Sometimes it's hard to place the time frame on some of these photographs if we come across them, you know, without any kind of notation on them. So this one we kind of have to roughly place in this time period, because that's sort of when Filipinos were really traveling by ship when they migrated to the US. For those who don't really know Filipino migration history, what accounts for Filipino migration to the US is that, you know, first in the late 20th century, I'm sorry, in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, agriculturalists and other major industries are really recruiting workers, foreign workers, specifically workers from Asia, to do low-wage work in agriculture, but also in the railroads. A lot of people are relatively familiar with railroads, with the fact that the Chinese were working railroads. But all of this is happening, right? This active recruitment of low-wage racialized workers to the United States was happening in the wake of the formal end of slavery, in the wake of emancipation after the Civil War. And after the Civil War, once enslaved Africans could no longer be enslaved. After emancipation, agriculturalists and other industry actors, a lot of industrialists, were really looking for another source of cheap labor. And the initial place where they were recruiting workers was from China. But then there was a massive pushback against Chinese workers in the form of anti-exclusion laws, specifically the Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act. It's always really interesting to note, actually, that some of the biggest anti-Asian leaders, or people who were leaders of the anti-Asian exclusion movement, included people like Stanford University, as well as McClatchy, who was the owner of the Sacramento Bee. So, you know, first, after industrialists or agriculturalists were looking for workers from China, and then they were met with these anti-Asian or anti-Chinese exclusion laws. Then they went to Japan as another force of cheap labor. Then the anti-Asian exclusionists would then also successfully lobby for the banning of Japanese workers, and ultimately would work towards the exclusion of all Asian migrants by 1934. But after the Chinese and the Japanese were excluded from being recruited to work in the United States, the US then went to the Philippines. Now, the Philippines presented agriculture and other employers with a really convenient pool of labor because we were actually not even considered immigrants. We were colonial subjects, right? In 1898, the United States violently defeated Filipino independence fighters, and the United States established the Philippines as a colony. And as part of their bid to try to win the hearts and minds of Filipinos, they established a system of public education. And as I said earlier, because the United States had colonized the Philippines, Filipinos were considered I'm sorry, let me see here. Okay, sorry. I don't know why, but when people join, I hear their audio right away. Maybe I have to adjust the settings. So maybe we just have to be mindful of that, y'all, just to kind of make sure you're muted. But at any rate, after the United States violently defeated Filipinos, colonized the Philippines, Filipinos became considered nationals as colonial subjects. So one of the interesting things is the United States government actually debated pretty hotly and about what to do with Filipinos once the Philippines became colonized. If they were going to be, basically, if the United States was to have jurisdiction over the Philippines, there was some debate as to whether or not then Filipinos were supposed to be considered citizens then of the United States if the US had jurisdiction over them. But because of these deeply racist ideas around who and who is not entitled to citizenship, lawmakers basically settled on Filipinos being considered nationals, which meant that they weren't citizens, but that they could also, it gave them some flexibility in terms of Filipinos traveling across borders. So, or at least between the border of the Philippines and the United States at this time. So that's why then the Philippines became a convenient source of workers for kind of big agriculture by the early 20th century after other sources were cut off. There's a question in the chat just about whether there were debates of the country being a state like Hawaii. I'm actually not fully familiar, to be honest, about what some of the critical debates were with a Hawaiian statehood and race. It's something that I would really have to defer to my colleagues who do that kind of work, whether or not these kinds of debates happened around, especially Hawaiian statehood. But I think it's a great question. I would imagine that some of those issues did come up, but I'm not really certain actually about any racialized debates related to the status of Native Hawaiians or just people in Hawaii upon the granting of statehood to Hawaii. But thank you for that. Now, in terms of early Filipino migration, so of course, Larry comes to the United States in 1929. He joins tens of thousands of Filipino migrants when he gets here, because really by 1930, we had tens of thousands of Filipinos by now. This is almost 30 years, if you can imagine, 30 years, 33 years or so after the Philam War, after the United States has established the Philippines as a colony. So it's been several decades now of US colonial rule, and that's really having its impacts on the Philippines. It has impacts on the Philippines economically. You can imagine that there was all sorts of recovery that had to happen in the wake of this incredibly brutal and violent war. There are several decades now of American public education, where the United States, again, is really trying to shape how Filipinos think about themselves as colonial subjects, how they think in relation to the United States. All of this is happening while, meanwhile, the United States is actively recruiting workers. And so, by then, all of this migration is really, really happening in the tens of thousands to the United States, with Larry being one of the tens of thousands who comes in 1929. in terms of what life looks like for Filipino farm workers, it's incredibly challenging. You see just a photo here of farm workers. There was farm workers often had to use something called los cortitos to harvest lettuce. Lettuce was one of the other many crops that Filipino migrants, including Larry, would have to pick. The Los Cortitos was a tool that required farmers to bend over continuously, leading to really chronic back and health issues. So in the 1970s, the UFW would actually lead the fight to ban its use. And remember, of course, that if you have Filipino farm workers arriving in the 1930s, and if they're, say, young men in the 1930s, around their 20s or so, it isn't, till the 1970s, several decades later, when they're already much older men, having worked in the field for quite some time already, by the time the UFW emerges, really, again, because of the unity of all of these different races of workers, when these tools are actually successfully banned, right? So really important to recognize how the union and the broader movement in support of the union became really decisive in helping to reshape the conditions of employment for farm workers by the 1970s. But for the early Filipino migrants, they're still having to deal with these kinds of working conditions. As Philip Veracruz, who was a leader in the farm worker movement, as he describes it, they lived in labor camps with no telephones, no air conditioning, no heater in the winter. It's hell. And they have lived that way every day of their lives in their country. And again, this is Mano Philip speaking by the time he's a leader in the farm worker movement in the 1970s. And he's describing a condition of life that Filipino migrant men, because they were predominantly men who were working in the fields, this is a condition of life that people had been suffering for, by then, nearly half of their lives, if not more, by the 1970s. Now, for the early Filipino migrants, not only were they literally dealing with backbreaking work, but they also had to deal with anti-Filipino racism. And the anti-Filipino racism came in the form of riots. Signs like this, that where basically people were being threatened that they shouldn't live in certain places, that they needed to kind of get out of town. I mean, sometimes it went beyond just the signs of like positively no Filipinos allowed that many people are now familiar with, but it would actually also involve these white vigilante roving groups of white vigilantes who would just drive people out of town, would literally burn kind of the homes of Filipinos down, leading even to death, to not just to violence, but to death. That happened in places like Watsonville, places like Exeter, California. One of the things that's really admirable about Filipinos is that almost as soon as they landed to work in the fields, they organized themselves to fight for their rights. And that is something that we can be so proud of, that Filipinos never backed down from a fight. They didn't simply accept the conditions of work without fighting for something better. One of the things about Manong Larry is he described himself as a mean son of a bee. But for Manong Larry, he was one of those people who immediately joined the fight. And not just join the fight to fight for Filipino migrant workers' rights, but to lead them in that fight. And this is really a classic quote from Manong Larry. He says this, right? "I have the ability to make the white man know I am just as mean as anybody in this world. I could make him think that I could make them, and I could make them recognize that I'm a mean son of a bee in terms of my direction fighting for the rights of Filipinos in this country, because I feel we are just as good as any of them. I feel that we have the same rights as any of them, because in that constitution, it said that everybody has equal rights and justice. You've got to make that come about. They're not going to give it to you." And so, one of the things I think that actually happened, so this is a Manong Larry. Manong Larry was not just a seasoned organizer by the time he met up with Cesar Chavez in 1965, and they came together and agreed to bring Filipino workers together with Mexican farm workers. But Manong Larry, he was unapologetic about fighting. He had this kind of edge to him. He was brash, and sometimes, some people might kind of think vulgar, uncouth, because, he was a cigar smoking guy, really, really fierce, was unapologetic about speaking up for farm workers' rights. And my suspicion, and I can't confirm this, but part of my suspicion as to why by the 1960s, when the United Farm Workers was eventually formed, and why, when again, after Manong Larry had met up with Cesar and they'd kind of done this work together, why it became Cesar Chavez as opposed to Manong Larry, who became kind of the main protagonist for this fight. I think it had to do partly with just the fact that he was so unapologetic about what he believed was the right of Filipinos, that he didn't kind of also fit that mold of kind of an Asian, that especially by the 1960s was already being propagated, that Asians were model minorities. He wasn't that model minority. He was breaking the mold in so many ways, and I think made people feel very, very, very uncomfortable with the ways that he was really unapologetic and fierce and militant about fighting for Filipino migrants. And I think that's kind of captured in this quote. Just to kind of go over just his history, Manong Larry, as I said, as pretty much as soon as he landed on the soils of what we now call the United States, as soon as he started working the soil of what we now call the United States as a farm worker, he was participating in labor struggles, and then by 1948 really stepping up as a leader. So by 1948, Filipino labor leaders Larry Itliong, along with Rudy Delvo, Philip Veracruz, they all became involved in the asparagus strike in Stockton, California. And the strike was led by Chris Salves and Ernesto Mangawang, who were members of the ILWU Local 37 Union. By 1956, Larry Itliong establishes the Filipino Farm Labor Union in Stockton. 1959, Larry Itliong, along with Philip Veracruz and Pete Velasco, joined with the AFL-CIO, which is the kind of labor confederation, to create the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, or AWOC. By 1960, Larry Itliong joins the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee in Stockton. By later in the year, by around May 1960, he begins working full time to build a union for farm workers in Delano. By 1965, AWOC members, again, remember AWOC is the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, and this is led by Larry and Ben Gines. They successfully demand a wage increase from Coachella table grape growers. This is really, really vital. Coachella isn't just what we think about it today. Coachella was the site for a major labor victory for Filipino table grape workers in 1965, and then by the very beginning of fall, late summer, September 8th, 1965, is when Filipino AWOC members convened at Delano's Filipino Community Hall. You might have remembered the earlier photo I had with Don Mabalon and Marissa Arroy. That was in front of the Filipino Community Hall, which you could still visit, and you can visit with us when we do the Filipino American Road Trip class in March. But by September 8th, Filipinos joined in together at the Filipino Community Hall and voted to go on strike against Delano's table grape growers. And that really marks the first day of what became the great Delano grape strikes. I think it's just important in terms of what it meant to actually get to that point, because the fields were very divided by race. As they had always done, big agriculture and farmers could always exploited divisions between the different races and ethnicities in the field. And so Asian Mexican relations, because of course, remember, Filipinos were not the only ones working who were Asian in the field. It was also the Japanese and the Chinese. After exclusion, people were still here. It's not as if there was a mass deportation campaign for the Chinese and the Japanese workers who had managed to get here. It just meant that new migration from those countries couldn't happen. And then Filipinos came to replace them. I should say, though, that there was an actual active campaign after Filipinos were eventually barred from coming to the United States in 1934. In 1935, Filipinos, there was actually a Repatriation Act that was passed by Congress. And the purpose of the Repatriation Act was basically to try to kind of lightweight deport Filipinos. Well, it was mainly to kind of offer them incentives to leave the US. I mean, that's how much anti-Asian exclusionists, or specifically anti-Filipino exclusionists, were so invested in not just stopping migration from the Philippines at some point in the 1930s and 1934, but they were so also invested in getting rid of us that they actually created this. They passed the Repatriation Act. But again, you're just going back to kind of the significance of Larry, the significance of his work is that his ability to bring people together, and when he helped to bring Filipinos and Mexicans together along with Arabs and other ethnicities of workers, is that this is happening against a context of great division. All of these quotes, are quotes also that, well, not all, but some of them we actually got from our interviews with the Welga Archive. So this is Lorraine Agtang, who also became a labor leader, is actually half Filipino and half Mexican. And she describes how there's always competition, like, oh, the Filipinos made 100 more boxes than you guys. As that was kind of what the growers would say like, oh, Filipinos are a little bit better than you. And, try to kind of make the workers compete and make them work even harder, and exploiting these ethnic divisions and even sometimes offering a little bit more for some ethnicities over others, just to keep that competition going, because the competition is what prevents the workers from uniting. And when the workers are not united, then they don't make demands for better wages across the board from the employer, right? This is how employers play people off of each other, so that at the end of the day, they are always able to enjoy maximum profits over kind of the workers' meager wages. I'd mentioned earlier, by 1934, all Asian migration was already prohibited. Increasingly, farm workers were being recruited from Mexico, which was kind of adding to more division across the fields, right? So Larry's legacy was that he was able to cultivate all of this unity across the division. Many Mexican farm workers joined the National Farm Worker Association, or the NFWA, while the Filipino farm workers were joining the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, or AWOC. And then, after this successful strike in Coachella, Filipino workers were able to win kind of an increase in their wages. And Larry, along with the workers and other Filipino labor leaders, really wanted to make sure that once the harvest came to Delano, because you have to understand, right? Filipino migrant farm workers were migrant farm workers in the sense that they literally had to follow the crop cycle. So you start off in one farm, finish all the vegetables and fruits there, then you need more work. You go to the next farm, and you just keep following it along and up the coast of California, or up California. And then once everything was picked from all those farms, then people would then go to Alaska, to the salmon canneries, to work in canneries. And so this was the dynamic. So, workers might be successful at a single farm at being able to raise their wages for maybe that particular period of time, but then they may not be able to enjoy the same kind of wages at another set of farms. And so for Manong Larry, it was like, we're not gonna be okay with earning less if we just won in this other site. And so he wanted to make sure that workers in the Delano grape fields would earn good wages. And so they made these kinds of demands as part of their strike. And again, by September 8th is when Filipinos walked off. Again, as part of their bid to exploit Mexican and Filipino farm workers, they often lived in separate camps. I said it before, but I'll say it again. They were often paid different wages. They were really encouraged to see each other as competition and to fight one another rather than uniting. But Manong Larry knew that power was in unity. And so he, after the Filipinos went on strike first, he knew that it wasn't going to be enough. And that's when about 8 days later, well, in the interim, like after the strike, he already starts approaching the Mexican farm worker organizers and starts to really broker this cooperation, so that by September 16th, the Mexican farm workers would eventually join up and they would together strike together. It was Larry who took this initiative to cross boundaries that had been long set up between the different races in the fields, and to really defy that division imposed in order to unite workers across racial lines. Larry realized the power of a unified strike, and that's when the AWOC and the NFW merged into what became the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, which was later called the United Farm Workers by 1972. Larry brought all of his experience to the Delano grape strikes at 62 years of age. Now, these are just some great images we have. If you haven't already checked it out, you should totally check out the Welga Archive that is housed, or that the Bulusan Center manages and is still in the process of growing. We're really trying to continue the work of collecting oral histories from Filipinos, artifacts, photos, documents from Filipinos who have memories of this moment, but even of just our activist history since then and even before. But again, going back to the coming together of the Mexican and Filipino farm workers, this really happened by September 16th, which is also Mexican Independence Day. And so it was just this huge celebratory moment for folks to come together in unity. And that happened in, again, about 8 days after Filipinos had first gone on strike. Beyond 1965, in that moment of the coming together of Filipino and Mexican farm workers, again, we have to remember it wasn't even just them. There were also Yemeni farm workers as well who were also part of this moment. But beyond that grape strike in 1965, there were so many other kinds of solidarity actions that happened. You had student activists who really got inspired by the manongs. I would argue that they got so inspired that they felt so bold to go on strike themselves. By 1968, at San Francisco State College, or San Francisco State University, what we know now as San Francisco State University, Filipino students joined with other students of color in fighting for ethnic studies. And, the Filipino students were very clear in their demands in recognizing that part of why they were fighting for ethnic studies was because they wanted to be able to make sure that the histories of their manongs, who were still fighting in the fields, that those histories be told in ethnic studies classes. And again, I would say that they were probably also inspired that if migrant farm workers can get it together and organize themselves in a strike that would have reverberations globally, then they should, feel emboldened too to fight and join together across racial divides to fight for ethnic studies. But students would also come down, college students would organize themselves and come down and learn from the manongs. Later on, you'll see here Filipinos, college students and youth would actually participate in building what became a retirement village for the elderly manongs, the Agbayani village. And we actually got a chance to visit that this weekend. But there was also the Jewish Federation Council that kind of got involved, other militant organizations like the Brown Berets and the Young Lords, but also even different organizations connected to or Black Power movement organizations were also part of it. And there was really just this cross-racial solidarity that wasn't just happening on the fields, but even in the broader community around other sets of issues, including the issues of ethnic studies. This is just photos photos that we have from the archive that just shows all the young folk who were helping to build this retirement building, this retirement village, which is really just remarkable, to think that people who didn't have these skill sets, but, it just also shows that it doesn't matter. You may not know how to do it, but if you have the will and the collective energy and drive, that we can pretty much do anything. And I take a lot of inspiration from the building of Agbayani Village, even in why I'm taking this bold step to even create this school for liberating education, because I believe that our community can do it. We've done it before, where we're able to kind of invest all of our energies and resources to creating institutions for ourselves. And Willie Barrientos has an oral history in our archive who talks about just all the many people who are volunteering. And these weren't just, of course, students of color, but even Germans. I think people were coming from out of the country, even Italians, Japanese, Chinese, and many other people. Again, other solidarity of kind of Black power organizations. Before kind of the Black liberation struggles, it was kind of these civil rights movement organizations like the NAACP. And this is just a flyer that just kind of attests to how the movement in the fields had these broader impacts for racial justice movements. Just to kind of show, to bring to the fore the role of Arab Americans as well. One of the things that was happening, there were already kind of other ethnicities of workers in the fields, but one of the things growers did was actually more actively recruit migrant workers from Yemen. So, the Great Strike in Delano happened by 65, and workers really stood firm. Eventually there became a boycott too of grapes, and growers, really resisting trying to come to the negotiation tables with the workers, just decide to try to recruit workers from somewhere else to then work the fields. And the Yemenis basically said, no, you're not going to do that to us. We're going to join along side of our Filipino and Latino and other kind of, communities in this fight. That actually led to lots of violence in the fields, and the killing of Naji Daifala at the age of 24 by the Kern County sheriff. So I think this is just a really great quote from a descendant of some of these early farm workers. He says they see themselves as one. The immigrants both came from different countries, but we came to a country where there were not a lot of rights back then and even now. And so one of the things that I want to just end with is we are really the embodiment of the legacy of Larry Itliong and the many, many manongs came before us. There continues to be struggles even now in the Central Valley. One of the things that we learned in going to the Central Valley and being part of the dedication for the Larry Itliong Resource Center is that there are Filipinos who do this who work as migrant farm workers even today. That circuit that Manong Larry and others took in the earlier part of the 20th century is still a circuit that in the 21st century that Filipinos are taking right now. They're going up and down the coast. Even though there was a great set of victories that happened in the 1970s for farm workers, many of the farm workers today do not enjoy rights in the same kind. Many of the rights that they were able to win have been eroded. The wages that they're earning are not good enough for the moment, and there continues to be struggles for not only better working conditions for Filipino farm workers, but even just their families. Access to clean water is an issue in the Central Valley for the Filipino migrant workers who are working today. And so, there's real, I feel that so much of the work of Manong Larry is work that still needs to be done. And fortunately, there are good people doing that work, like the Central Valley Empowerment Alliance, which we went to support this weekend. They're the ones that opened up the Larry Itliong Resource Center in Poplar, California. And of course, they're doing that great work. There's other work like Little Manila Rising, also helped that Dr. Don Mabalon helped to found. It's also doing this advocacy work for Filipinos, but also communities of color who suffer from all of the pollution and environmental problems that get created by agriculture even today for communities all throughout Central Valley. And so that's kind of it. I didn't want this to kind of go too long. I can go for a long time. Y'all have plenty of opportunity to hear from me if you sign up and register for the Filipino American experience course that will launch in January 2022. We have 2 more free webinars coming up. We will be, I'll have some guest speakers come in, someone who will be talking about the current anti-gentrification fight led by Filipinos in San Francisco. Some people may know that Filipinos had to fight gentrification in the 1960s. In fact, we're fighting to ensure that manongs, including many of the manongs that Manong Larry was fighting for, that manongs would not be ousted from their home, which was the International Hotel in San Francisco. So that was a fight that our community was engaged in, and we continued to be engaged in a fight for the right to live in San Francisco, for housing rights. So we'll be hearing from an activist, Angelica Cabande, who's at the forefront of that. We'll also be doing a hip hop writing workshop from a youth activist, Ray Castillo, who was working as part of this anti-gentrification work. He was a tenants organizer with the organization that Angelica leads, but is now doing other kind of work. But he's also an artist and is part of the Doble Bera group. And so he's going to be leading a hip hop workshop that we'll also be offering as part of the free webinar series. And so with that, this just concludes our my lecture. I'm hoping that we'll be able to chat more. I'd love for y'all who were able to join us to leave some comments or questions in the chat. I'm hoping to actually maybe schedule in between the webinars an opportunity for just conversation with me for folks who have more questions about this particular webinar or the other upcoming webinars, and just about the work that I do, or just about the class that we're launching in 2022. But do leave any questions you may have in the comments so I can kind of process them. And then we'll let you know when we host more of a Q&A session with me after this webinar gets shared out to the rest of the pre-registrants. But again, thank you for those of you who were able to join us live, and see you all sometime soon. Take care.